Welcome, everybody, to Compassion in Action. Today, we have with us a remarkable man, Fred Beasley II, also known as Dr. Goodbody, also known as Dr. G, and also known as Doc. He's a dynamic speaker, a health and wellness educator. He's a filmmaker of Raise Up, The World is Our Gem, the author of Heru, the Happy Dragon, and a feature writer in the anthology Brother Vegan. He's a creative music director and a global youth culture architect. Welcome, Doc. You are a man of many names and many talents, and we're so glad to have you with us today.
First of all, thank you for that wonderful introduction. And I wanted to say that it's going to be hard to follow the lead of Mr. Rowe, but I will say that many of the things that he spoke about actually tie into why my book is called Heru, the Happy Dragon. And I find many of the things that he said fascinating. And we need to do a book together, good sir. But anyway, I digress.
That leads us into our first question. Can you tell us a bit about that book, Heru, the Happy Dragon? Why did you write it, and why did you choose a dragon as the hero?
Great question. So as you can see, Heru, the Happy Dragon is my first children's book. And I wrote this book because two things. One, I have 4 children, and seeing those children look for heroes outside themselves forced me to find an imaginary medium in which they could see themselves, but at the same time have empathy. The dragon becomes the main hero because in most folk tales, the dragon is fierce and considered dangerous. As an original man or so-called African-American man in the world, many times we are considered dangerous. The dragon represents the original people of the diaspora, who's a mystical character, but at the same time, many times maligned and misunderstood.
So that is a nice segue into another question that I wanted to ask you. You've been an activist for so many fronts. You've been an activist for animals, for people, for food, for fitness. What began your activism and what inspired you to become an activist? Kind of the same question.
My mother passed away when I was 5. And people asked me to look in various directions to seek her. But it was when I looked into my imagination. It's a famous quote that Einstein says that imagination is greater than knowledge. And it was in that imagination where I found my safe space. So exercise, food, all these different forms of activism are essentially forms of finding ways to activate the human being. And as a humans, what are we being? As so-called children of the creator, I feel it is our job to create. What are we creating? It's in the fact of being that we can create the life that we seek. So many times those outside things simply become symbols that the imagination can hang a hat on. It's a famous quote by Sun Tzu. It says that words are symbols and symbols have meaning. Where can I find a man who knows the meaning of the symbol so I can have a word with him? Essentially, that is the foundation of my book. It's a book full of symbols to spark the imagination of young people to understand that they have a potential that's unlimited.
So using words as symbols, It reminds me of the title that many of us here at Compassion Consortium are intrigued by, a title that was in some of the stuff we read about you, some of the stuff I read about you, but you call yourself a global youth culture architect. What does that, can you talk a bit about that and what it means to you?
Yes, I've had the opportunity to travel the world, and in traveling the world, I've seen the beauty of the children, and in knowing that the children, in their, some would say, innocence or naivety, have a view of the world that hasn't been hardened, or they haven't allowed a callus to grow over their imagination because of their experiences. As a global youth culture architect, it is that culture of youthfulness that unites us, because again, the children still have an unfettered imagination. So I forget the quote that says that we don't we don't grow old. We don't grow old because we stop playing, or we don't stop playing because we grow old, but we grow old because we stop playing. That play is the imagination at work. So for me, art is an extension of that play, that playtime. And it's in putting things together. You know, when I wrote this book, my uncle told me his name is Bewis Hardison. He's been around the world doing paintings. And he said, you might want to make your first book not have people as characters. Because when people see another person as a character, they place their preconceived notions or quote unquote prejudices onto the character automatically. So this is why, Martin spoke eloquently about you, the great scriptures using animals, and the great wisdom teaching using animals, because the animal transcends the person. And in the animal, you can see something that's outside yourself that yet connects back to yourself. And in this book, Karu the Happy Dragon, you have this dragon who, for years he served the crown. What is the crown? The crown is the dogma, the doctrine. And one day he gets the courage to go to the crown and ask, and he asks, "Hey, can I proceed with my journey?" And they laugh at him. And what happens is he's big enough and strong enough to literally destroy the so-called crown with the swoop of his tail or the fire from his nostrils. But he does none of that. He gathers himself, he composes himself, and he calmly flies away, because he realizes at that time it's not about destroying what's outside of him. It's about reconciling his idea of who he is. And that's what leads him to lay down his sword and his shield and pick up his apron and a spatula. Because, someone told me at one time that the first supper or the last supper was really that's the first church. Mm-hmm. So food has this integral part of communion, of community. So for this dragon who for many moons has basically defended the crown, and he's gained all the trappings of material success, to lay that down and say, now I want to feed you something outside of quote unquote destruction. Mm. So all these things are there, and he has, once he leaves, the king sends his people to go get him. And when they come, they can't believe that they see him now in a garden. and he has a smile on his face. Why? Because again, the dragon was to be considered fierce. But he's happy in creating a world in where he doesn't have to use his powers and his restraint. If that makes sense.
You know, Doc, I know Harry the Happy Dragon is a children's book, but you speak so eloquently and so much from the heart about it. I think it's a book that we adults could learn from as well. So one last question. If there was something today, what is the one thing that each of us today could do after the service is over to make the world a more compassionate place?
Wow. It almost brings a tear to my eye. But the same love that we profess to have for other beings and species, have that same compassion for yourself and for the people that you come in contact with.
Thank you for that. And we do forget that. I've heard that time and time again in the animal rights movement. So thank you for that wisdom, Doc. And thank you for being with us today. It's been a real pleasure, a great pleasure.
Thank you for having me. It's a blessing to be here.
Well, we're blessed to have you. Sarah, back to you now.
I can attest it is an excellent book for adults because I have a copy. So Elaine, I agree with you. And thank you, Dr. Beasley, for writing this book, for sharing yourself in the world with this way.